Hi everyone, welcome to your online lecture for the course Human Anatomy. In today's lecture we're going to be covering the digestive system, which is the system that's full of various organs that are going to take the food that we consume, break it down, take out the nutrients, then our body can actually use those nutrients for survival, and then our digestive system has this way to eliminate whatever we don't need. Here's an overview of the digestive system, which is oftentimes collectively referred to as the gastrointestinal tract. And it really starts at the mouth. So that's where food, of course, is consumed. And then we have the pharynx, the esophagus, which we've talked about, which pierces through the diaphragm, which is right here. And then here we have the stomach. From the stomach, food will move into the small intestine, which is all throughout here, and then it will eventually make its way to the large intestine, moving through the different components. Then it will enter the rectum, and we're talking, of course, at this point about food that's going to be eliminated and not absorbed by the body, and then will exit the body through the anus. And what's interesting about the digestive system is that this entire gastrointestinal tract that I just spoke about is really part of our external environment. And it's not until food or nutrients actually enter our bloodstream, which you'll learn more about in functional anatomy, that the food or the nutrients is part of our internal environment. Now we also have organs that play more of a role in helping with digestion. So they are necessary for digestion, but the difference is that with many of these organs, and we'll talk about a few of them in particular, so the liver, the pancreas, or the gallbladder and the pancreas, food doesn't actually come into contact directly with these structures, but they are still part of our digestive system. And you'll see a little bit later, and certainly in functional anatomy or human physiology, that these structures will secrete substances, these organs will secrete substances that contribute to our ability to break down food. But our teeth are important in actually breaking down the food that we consume into smaller pieces so that the digestive juices, which contain various enzymes, can actually break down that food even further. Our tongue has this ability to place food at the level of our teeth to contribute to that mechanical digestion that I just spoke about. And then our salivary glands, these glands will produce substances that lubricate and moisten the food that you eat, but they also contribute to some digestion, in particular of carbohydrates within the mouth because of the enzymes that they secrete. So we can see here the liver, and we spoke about the esophagus before, joining in with the stomach, and then the start of the small intestine here. And we can also see the pancreas. Here's one end of the pancreas, but you can see the other end through here. But what I wanted to point out to you now, so it was familiar to you, is that both the liver and the pancreas have this, and the gallbladder have these ducts that will allow them to empty their contents into the small intestine, which will contribute to digestion of food within the small intestine. This slide shows us the various stages in digestion. So of course, first we have to actually intake food. Then once we do, different forms of digestion will occur that is both mechanical and chemical in nature. So mechanical is the physical process of breaking down food. It might be chewing. It could include the actual muscular contractions that occur within our stomach that actually help break down that food so that chemicals can access them easier. Absorption is where we take in the nutrients that we have just broken down into their smallest form. So for example, glucose from the carbohydrates that we eat, and we will absorb it into our blood. If it's proteins that break down into amino acids, we also absorb those into the blood. So I spoke just now about proteins and carbohydrates and how we absorb them. But any fats that we break down, they don't get absorbed directly into our blood, which is made up of a lot of water. Instead, they get absorbed into lymphatic capillaries. Next up is compaction, which is where our body will absorb water, really trying to compact the residue from our food into feces. And then defecation is the actual proper term for the elimination of feces. The next two slides talk about saliva and our salivary glands and the anatomy of them. And we have two main types, intrinsic and extrinsic, and we'll be focusing most on extrinsic salivary glands on the next slide. And the reason for that is because they are our larger glands, and you'll see this when we look at the images. But the intrinsic ones, they are smaller. They're dispersed all throughout our oral tissue, including our tongue, our lips, the roof of our mouth, and the inside of our cheek. So basically all throughout our mouth we have these small glands that are called intrinsic salivary glands. But it's the lingual, remember lingual means tongue, lingual glands that produce what's called lingual lipase. We know this is an enzyme because it ends in ASE. Any enzymes end with ACE. And lip refers to lipids. So this is an enzyme that will help break down fats. Labial refers to the lips. Palatine, this is the roof of your mouth. Recall the palatine bone. And buccal refers to the cheeks. The extrinsic salivary glands, these are connected to your mouth by ducts. So they produce a substance, then they release that substance, being saliva, through these ducts into your mouth. And we'll talk about these three, the parotid, submandibular, and sublingual gland, next. Okay, so here we have the extrinsic salivary glands that were introduced on the previous slide, and we'll start with the parotid gland. The parotid gland is located really just anterior to your ear. And you can see the duct, the parotid duct, that would allow for the release of the salivary production or saliva production into the mouth. Submandibular gland. We know that sub means beneath, and we know what the mandible is. So this is a gland located beneath the mandible. And you can see it here. And you can also see the submandibular duct associated with it. And the sublingual gland. Sub again means below. Lingual is referring to the tongue. So this is beneath the tongue. And you can see it beneath the tongue in this image. And the difference with this gland compared to the others, it has multiple ducts. And you can see the openings to those ducts here. So the sublingual ducts. So all of those glands that we just spoke about will produce and release a saliva that is different from one another. So it may contain more enzymes or more mucus or more of a watery substance depending on the gland, but all are contributing to the lubrication and at least the beginning of digestion of certain foods. Now the oral cavity, which is also called the buccal cavity, this is of course where you're ingesting your food, and we talked a little bit about how some digestion occurs within the mouth, meaning that there are certain enzymes within the mouth that can actually break down certain foods such as carbohydrates, or at least start that digestion, and even some absorption, which might really surprise you. The absorption of simple sugars can occur within the mouth to a certain extent, where they can move across the oral mucosa and then go directly into the bloodstream. Let's point out a few major anatomical structures of the buccal cavity. The first one I wanted to point out has to do with the palate, and we've looked a little bit at the palate already, but in previous lectures. But here's the hard palate. And you can see that there's the presence of rugae within the hard palate. Rugae are those ridges that you can see. And what they do is they aid or help your tongue in holding and manipulating food. And then Behind that, or posterior to that, we have the soft palate. So the difference between the hard and soft palate is that the hard palate has bone underlying the mucosa, whereas the soft palate does not. It's a soft tissue. There's a structure that hangs at the back of the mouth, really the central region of your soft palate, called the uvula. What the uvula does is it helps retain food in your mouth until one is ready to swallow. Another structure is called the vestibule. The vestibule of the mouth is the area between the teeth, lips, and the cheeks. Then we have a few different structures that have the word frenulum. And frenulum really refers to a fold or a ridge of tissue. And so we can see that there is a fold or a ridge of tissue, which you can easily identify in yourself if you lift up your mouth, where it's some tissue that's really attaching your part of your lip to your gums. So we have a superior labial referring to lips, and an inferior labial frenulum. Then we also have a lingual frenulum. This is a larger tissue connecting the tongue to the floor of the mouth. In infants that have trouble possibly with breastfeeding, they may have a tongue tie, which means that there is too much tissue here and it's attached too much anterior to the tongue, not allowing the infant to properly stick out their tongue to allow for a proper latch with breastfeeding. So that's just an interesting fact for you, and it can be easily corrected in most cases by just snipping and removing some of this excess tissue. Then if we look at the tongue itself, we have the root of the tongue, the back part, and this is where a lot of the tonsils are found. And then we have the body of the tongue, and then really this is the tip of the tongue, as you might remember from your sensory organs lecture, and then various taste buds found scattered throughout, with the majority found at the posterior part of the tongue here. As part of the villi, within the villi papillae. Okay, and let's have a look at the teeth and mastication. So the mastication is a term that properly describes the chewing of food, and we have three main categories: your incisors, your canines, and your premolars or your molars. We can see that the incisors up here exist as both central and lateral incisors, and these are involved really in the slicing of food. Canines are involved in more so just stabilizing the food that you're eating. And then your premolars and your molars, there are a handful of them on either side. These are really for grinding and mechanically breaking down food. And so it's your tongue really that places the food at the level of your molars so that you can grind at it and break it down properly. I should also mention that, just going back to the tongue here for a moment, that we have many different muscles that make up our tongue that allow us to move our tongue in different directions, to articulate, so for speech, and also to place food at the level of our molars, as I already mentioned. And the tongue will consist of both extrinsic and intrinsic muscles, and the main difference between the two is that the intrinsic muscles are all found within your tongue, meaning that the origin and the insertion is within the tongue, but the extrinsic muscles actually originate somewhere else and then insert into the tongue. So lots of different muscles that make it up. We have 20 deciduous teeth, which are our baby teeth, and then we should end up with 32 adult teeth, which are the permanent teeth. And what's interesting, and I don't have an image of it here, but you can look it up yourself to see where the permanent teeth actually reside. So if when you're young and you have your baby teeth, your adult teeth or your permanent teeth are actually stored, for lack of a better word, within your maxilla and your mandible, and then they will descend, eventually pushing out the baby teeth and find their final resting place. So if you can look up an image of this, it's actually quite neat. If we look at the tooth itself and the different components of it, the white substance that surrounds the tooth is called your enamel, a term you've probably heard of. This is something you need to keep nice and strong. Dentin is all of this structure within here that takes on a yellowy straw-like color. And in fact, most of a tooth consists of this hard yellowish tissue that I just mentioned called dentin that's covered by the enamel. Another structure is the pulp, and the pulp is what you can see all through here. The pulp is a mass of loose connective tissue. There's blood, lymphatic vessels, and nerves present in this area, and that's pretty obvious when you look at it. Gingiva refers to your gums, if you've heard of gingivitis. And then the root canal. So this is a long canal that you can see that structures that are found within the pulp or that make up the pulp will travel down through the root canal. And sometimes if somebody has bacteria that is overgrown and really eaten away at many of the structures that make up the tooth, they'll have to go in for a root canal where they have to have a lot of this cleaned out and removed and then filled with a substance to keep it safe and healthy. Three main parts of the tooth include the crown, which is the top part, the neck, which is really the neck of the tooth just beneath the crown, and then we have the root of the tooth, which falls beneath, as you can see here, beneath the gingiva. And if we look at the teeth sort of as a whole, they're called dentition. Okay, now we're moving on. We've talked a lot about the mouth, but now we're going to be moving on down and talking about different structures. We've spoken about the pharynx already in our unit covering the respiratory system. And so that, remember, contains both or all three structures: your nasopharynx, your oropharynx, and your laryngopharynx, collectively called your pharynx. And we talked about how air will travel through all parts of the pharynx, whereas food and drink will only travel through your oro and your laryngopharynx. So let's have a look at the tissue layers that make up the digestive tract, and we'll look at them from a superficial to deep perspective. This here, if you can try to envision, is actually your esophagus. So here's the diaphragm where the esophagus pierces the diaphragm, and if we look closely within the esophagus to see what makes it up, you can see that there are four primary layers. And what's interesting is these are consistent, these layers, with other parts of our digestive tract as well. But there will be fine differences in terms of exactly what makes up those layers and what the role is. But we can generally say that if we go from most superficial or most external, we have our serosa, the more outer layer, which is continuous with serosa of other organs as well. We have the muscularis layer, so you can see all the muscles through here. And there are two components, the inner circular and the outer longitudinal, and that just has to do with the direction that the muscle fibers run. Then we have a submucosa. You'll find some glands originating within the submucosa region, but it's the mucosa layer that consists of stratified squamous epithelial tissue, which you might recall is that real tough tissue. So that's why you can swallow substances such as a cracker without chewing it properly, and the walls, the inner walls, because they're made of this stratified squamous epithelial tissue, are protected from the abrasion that swallowing that cracker would create. But we'll learn soon that within the stomach and then certainly within the small intestine, there are lots of glands scattered throughout here that are going to produce various different substances that will contribute to the digestion of certain foods. But they also may just be substances that overall promote the health or the proper environment of that organ. So let's first look at the stomach in terms of really the organs that strongly contribute to digestion. It is a muscular sac found in the upper left of the abdominal cavity, beneath or inferior to the diaphragm, which makes sense because we said that the esophagus will pierce through the diaphragm, so that it makes sense that your stomach is beneath it. It's really a food storage organ, so some digestion breaks down here, but very little, if any, absorption, which might surprise you. So to restate that, we don't absorb much at all within our stomach of the food and drink that we consume. When it's empty, it's only could house about 50 milliliters of volume in its empty state, but after a meal, it can commonly enlarge up to 1.5 liters, so we can have that much fluid and food within it. But if we overdo it, as oftentimes we do, especially myself when I go to buffets, is that you can have upwards of 4 liters within your stomach, but this would cause quite a bit of discomfort. So what does the stomach do? Well, it's going to contract because it has all of those muscles, and you can see the different muscles here that are going to help further break down your food, help break it down into as small of a part as it can. Also, when the stomach contracts, it helps put the food in contact with some of the chemical enzymes that aid in digestion, in particular of protein and fat. Now, once food has been mixed around with all the different secretions within the stomach, it will leave the stomach and enter the first part of the small intestine. Now, when we put food into our mouth and start chewing it and swallow it into the esophagus, and then when it enters the stomach, it's oftentimes referred to as a bolus of food, spelt B-O-L-U-S. But once this food, or this bolus of food, is broken down in your stomach, or at least broken down to some extent and mixed with different secretions, and entering the small intestine, it now has a new name, and it's called chyme. And this is when it's in a state of a very soupy or pasty type of texture of semi-digested food that will enter the small intestine. And once it enters the small intestine, then this is where most of the digestion or breakdown occurs because of the addition of enzymes, but also this is where we will start absorbing food once it's digested into our blood and lymphatic system. Looking now at the gross anatomy of the stomach, so really what we could see with the human eye, there are different components that you need to be aware of. We have here the diaphragm, and then we have the esophagus piercing through the diaphragm. And then when food first enters the stomach, this region, as soon as we get to the start of the stomach, is called the cardiac region. But there's a part that is a bit more superior than where the esophagus actually attaches to the stomach, and that's called the fundic region. The majority of the stomach is called the body. And then the end part of the stomach, this region here, is called the pyloric region. And then we can see a sphincter here, or a doorway from the stomach where food or chyme would enter the small intestine. This is called the pyloric sphincter. So the pyloric sphincter then is part of the pyloric region. And it's not shown on here, but we know that the first part of the stomach where the esophagus joins in with the stomach is called the cardiac region. And so you probably would guess that there is a sphincter present here as well. And remember, the purpose of these sphincters, or these doorways, is one-way movement, so that food is moving in one direction here, in one direction down through here. What we don't want is it moving back up. Another name for the cardiac sphincter that you might see is called the lower esophageal sphincter. So right here, so it's just the sphincter at the lower end of the esophagus, lower esophageal sphincter. And in certain situations, such as certain conditions, certain diseases, even just the condition of pregnancy, or even in stressful situations, this valve or I should say the sphincter, the lower esophageal sphincter, might not work as well as it should. And so the stomach is a very acidic environment. And so sometimes the acidic substances can move upward. And when it moves upward, it can give you that burning sensation, which people describe as heartburn. Okay, a few other structures relating to the gross anatomy, starting with the greater and lesser curvatures of the stomach. You can see a curvature here and a curvature here. The smaller curvature is called the lesser curvature, and the larger curvature is called the greater curvature. You might remember from the beginning of the term when we were talking about the greater and lesser omentum, and I had commented that once we get to the digestive system, you will learn that the reason that they're called the greater and lesser omentum is because they hang off the lesser curvature in the case of the lesser omentum and the greater curvature in the case of the greater omentum. There are 3 layers of muscle. Listed here as longitudinal, circular, and oblique, and they get their names based on the direction of the muscle fibers and how they run. And this allows for really the greatest efficiency when the stomach is contracting to really be able to contact as much food as possible and break it down and put it into contact as well with some of the chemicals that are secreted. And gastric rugae, which are all of these grooves that you can see throughout. These grooves, or the rugae, will increase the surface area of the stomach, but as you'll see on the next slide, when the stomach is full, these rugae really disappear. They become stretched out. So now we're going to spend the next couple slides talking about microscopic anatomy of the stomach, so what you can't see with the human eye, and you would need a microscope to see it. And the stomach consists of simple columnar epithelial tissue covering the mucosa, and you don't need to know that detail there specifically for your final written exam. But you would recall that what this means is that it contains a single layer, hence simple, of columnar, which are column-shaped cells. The mucosa and the submucosa layers, remember we have the mucosa, the submucosa, muscularis, and serosa layer that we talked about at the beginning of this lecture. They are flat and stretched out when the stomach is full, but they form gastric rugae when empty, as mentioned just previously. And you can see those 3 different muscular layers as well. The gastric mucosa, or that inner lining of our stomach, has these depressions found within it that are called gastric pits. And each of these gastric pits will have 2 to 3 different glands that open up into the bottom of it. And depending on where we're talking about in the stomach, they're called something different. So if we're in the cardiac region of the stomach, they're called cardiac glands. If we're in the pyloric region, they're called pyloric glands. And in the rest of the stomach, they're called just gastric glands. And you can see that they look a little bit different in terms of their overall appearance, but also in terms of the cells that make them up. And on this slide, we'll talk about those cells. So first of all, you can see the same image as the previous slide looking at pyloric and gastric glands. The mucus cells that are present within our stomach are found in both the gastric and the pyloric glands, and as the name suggests, they produce and secrete mucus. Regenerative stem cells are also present. They're found in the base of the pit as well as in the neck of the gland, not shown on this slide. So this is just where regeneration will occur if there's injury to the cells, to other cells. Parietal cells, these are found in both your pyloric and your gastric gland, usually in the upper part of the gland, and they're very important in terms of their secretion of hydrochloric acid, which contributes to the acidity of the stomach, and it's necessary for the stomach to be acidic for 2 main reasons. One is to activate certain enzymes that can only be activated in an acidic environment, and also to kind of ward off or kill pathogens that enter your stomach before they can pass through the stomach and potentially infect the body. Intrinsic factor is also produced by parietal cells, and intrinsic factor helps you absorb vitamin B12. So when you consume foods that contain vitamin B12, and vitamin B12 is necessary for the production of healthy red blood cells, what will happen is intrinsic factor will act sort of like a bodyguard carrying B12 through your stomach and through part of your small intestinal tract where it can then be absorbed. Without intrinsic factor, vitamin B12 just doesn't make it. It doesn't make it as far as it needs to go for absorption. So people that have problems with maybe their parietal cells, or maybe they don't produce intrinsic factor, they tend to be vitamin B12 deficient. And ghrelin, which is also called your hunger hormone that stimulates appetite. Chief cells, you can see, are found in your gastric glands, so they're absent from your pyloric, but also from your cardiac glands. These are found in abundance. They produce two main substances, including lipase and pepsinogen. Lipase we talked about already in terms of its production in the mouth, and it's an enzyme involved in digesting fat, so ACE for enzyme, lip for fat. Pepsinogen, this is involved in the breakdown of protein. Now, pepsinogen is an inactive form, but when it's in the presence of hydrochloric acid, so in other words, when it's in an acidic environment, it can convert to its active form, which is called pepsin. And finally, we have enteroendocrine cells. Remember that term endocrine has to do with hormones, but there are so many different types of enteroendocrine cells that are found within the stomach, but in addition to secreting hormones, they secrete paracrine messengers. And paracrine messengers are really local hormones that are just going to diffuse a very short distance to other cells, whereas any endocrine hormones, we know that they're going to be traveling into the blood longer distances. Well, for the next few slides, we're going to be talking about some of our accessory organs to digestion, including the gallbladder, the pancreas, and the bile that moves from the gallbladder into, as you'll see, the small intestine. So this slide's showing you here the gallbladder. It's showing you various ducts that will take substances from the gallbladder and put it into the small intestine, and then the pancreas, which also has a duct bringing substances into the small intestine. What's removed off this structure, which would be located around right here, is our liver. And here's an image showing you a little bit up close what we're looking at. So this would be the right side of the body, where the gallbladder is and where the liver is. We'll start with the pancreas. The pancreas is a retroperitoneal gland, and it's a gland because it secretes substances, including both hormones and digestive juices. So it's called an endocrine and an exocrine gland because of the hormone secretions and the digestive juices secretions. Remember, I explained briefly the difference between these two in that endocrine is going to put a hormone into the blood, whereas an exocrine secretion is going to be released through a duct, and that's what's relevant to today's lecture, is digestive juices produced here that are going to be released into the small intestine via a duct. Two main ducts to be aware of. The pancreatic duct is just the duct leading from the pancreas really into the small intestine, where we know that most digestion and absorption, but digestion in this case is going to occur. So it states here on the slide that the pancreatic duct joins the bile duct at the hepatopancreatic ampulla. So here we have the pancreatic duct that's going to join this structure here, which is the bile duct, at the hepatopancreatic ampulla, We spoke about the term ampulla in one of our in-class lectures being kind of this widened region. So these two ducts then come together, one from the gallbladder and one from the pancreas, in order to release their contents into the small intestine. There's a sphincter that's present here that really helps to control or regulate the release of certain substances coming from the gallbladder and coming from the pancreas into the first part of the small intestine, which is called the duodenum. Finally, we also have an accessory pancreatic duct, and that's shown here. And this will allow for just the movement. Let's say we aren't having bile moved into the small intestine, but pancreatic juices are necessary, then the accessory pancreatic duct can be used. Next, we'll talk about the liver. The liver is considered the largest gland within the body. It secretes many different substances. You can see its location and how large it is, and somewhat protected by our rib cage, with the majority of the liver being located on the right side of the body in almost everyone. The liver has 4 lobes, and when we look at the anterior view, we can only see 2 lobes, the right lobe and the left lobe. But if we look at the inferior, so not the posterior, but the inferior surface, we can see that there's actually 4 lobes. So right and left lobe, as already stated, and the caudate lobe and the quadrate lobe. So 4 lobes then include the right and left lobe, the caudate lobe, and the quadrate lobe. Now these lobes are separated by what's called the falciform ligament, and the falciform ligament and its extensions separate then the different components of major components or major lobes of the liver. The liver's main role, one of the liver's main roles in digestion, is going to be the secretion of bile, and bile is going to be involved in fat digestion. Of interesting note, the round ligament here is actually a remnant of part of the umbilical cord, specifically the umbilical vein. So after utero, it will change, after a person is born, it will change into a round ligament. So if we have a close look at the liver, we can see a few different important things. The first thing I wanted to mention is that the cells of the liver are called hepatocytes. And when you see the term hepat, think of the liver, which is different than hemat, where we spoke about blood. So the liver contains hepatic lobules, all these different regions where various activities will occur. But there's also these hepatic sinusoids found throughout the liver. And this should be a familiar term to you from our lesson on capillaries, where sinusoids are these blood-filled channels, a very unique type of capillary. And these hepatic sinusoids, or these vessels, are going to receive blood from the stomach and the intestines. So what does that mean? Well, all of the food that you eat and the nutrients that you break down that will end up in your blood, being absorbed into your blood from your stomach, but in particular from your intestinal tract, it doesn't go right to your heart to be pumped out to the rest of the body. It first needs to be cleaned and prepared before your heart will pump it out to the rest of your body. So all this blood, once again, that contains newly ingested nutrients will travel to the liver, where the liver will clean it. And then from there, it will move out of the liver once cleaned, once detoxified, and it will be sent to the right side of your heart. And then, of course, we know that the right side of the heart will then pump this blood to the lungs to be oxygenated, and now we'll have oxygen-rich and nutrient-rich blood that will be brought back to the left side of the heart to be pumped out to the rest of your body. The liver also has bile canaliculi, which are these little extensions that will release bile into smaller ducts. And we'll look at this in a moment, but really what this means is that the liver produces bile, and this bile needs to go somewhere to be stored. And where does it go? Well, it goes to the gallbladder, which you can just see the end of it here. It's stored in the gallbladder, so it will travel through ductules in order to eventually reach the gallbladder. And we'll see that on the next slide. So here we have the gallbladder. And again, this is where bile is stored after it's produced within the liver. So once bile is formed in the liver and leaves through bile ductules, as just mentioned on the previous slide, okay, so the bile is produced, it enters these bile canaliculi, which send the bile into these bile ductules. It will then travel into a hepatic duct. So this is a main duct off the liver. Okay, so the liver, of course, is removed, but these are coming off of the liver. The bile would travel through the hepatic ducts into a common, so now there's a common hepatic duct. Then from here, it's going to travel into the gallbladder through a cystic duct. And from the cystic duct, it will store within here. Now, when you consume fat, the fat enters the stomach, then will enter the small intestine. When fat is present here, the gallbladder is going to be signaled to release bile. So bile will be squeezed out of the gallbladder. It will travel through this bile duct, which you might remember converges with your pancreatic duct to form, or really at the hepatic pancreatic ampulla, where bile will be released into the small intestine. And bile, as already mentioned, will help with the digestion of fat. Now, just as a side note, if you have somebody who has to have their gallbladder removed, what does that mean? Well, what it means is that they don't have a storage site for bile anymore. And so when there's fat present within here, the liver is just going to be kind of constantly releasing bile instead of only releasing it from the gallbladder when necessary. So it can kind of overload the small intestine with bile, even when it's not necessary. And so sometimes people have to have their gallbladder removed because of what's called cholelithiasis, which are gallstones. Okay, so what have we spoken about so far? We've talked about different accessory organs of our digestive system, including those that might come into contact with food, such as your teeth and your tongue, but the ones that don't come into contact with food but still contribute largely to digestion include your pancreas and your liver and your gallbladder and your salivary glands. Now we're going to talk about the small intestine. So just as another recall, we have food moving through the esophagus that at that time is called a bolus of food, moves into the stomach where both mechanical digestion and some chemical digestion are going to occur with very little absorption. We do absorb certain medications such as aspirin and some water and some alcohol through our stomach, but most of the food that we consume is not absorbed here. Then, once food is ready and it becomes this soupy mixture called chyme, it's going to move into the duodenum, which is the first part of the small intestine. And we're going to talk about the different parts of the small intestine on the next couple of slides. So once again, most chemical digestion and nutrient absorption are occurring within the small intestine. It's the longest part of your digestive tract, so it's called the small intestine only because its diameter is small compared to that of the large intestine. So the first region of the small intestine, as already stated, is the duodenum, and the duodenum would begin right after food or chyme leaves the stomach. And so it begins at the pyloric valve, which we spoke about as the pyloric sphincter through this region here. And it's going to end at the duodenojejunal flexure. All that means is that the first part of the small intestine is the duodenum. The second part's actually the jejunum. And so right where, here's your duodenum, right where it flexes, that's called the duodenojejunal flexure. And now we enter the second part of the small intestine. And one of the ways I remembered the order was DJI. So we've talked about the duodenum. Next, we're going to talk about the jejunum. So the jejunum. This is much more rich in blood supply than other areas, and that's because it's the jejunum where most digestion and, in particular, nutrient absorption is going to occur. The final part of the small intestine is the ileum. So we've talked about the duodenum, leading to the jejunum, leading to the ileum. And right where the ileum comes into contact with the first part of the large intestine, right here, this is called the ileocecal junction. And it gets the name because ileo refers to the ileum. Cecal, well, this region here, the first part of the large intestine, is called the cecum. And so that's where the name ileocecal junction comes from. And there's an ileocecal valve which permits that one-way movement of food from the ileum into the cecum. So you can see here when we talked about at the beginning of the term how spelling is important. Remember, we have an ileum with an I here that would represent part of our pelvis versus with an E, we're talking now about the lower part of the small intestine. Okay, so that was ileocecal valve. And another feature of the ileum are Peyer's patches. Peyer's patches are these patches really of lymphatic tissue. So they are patches that are involved in our immune system because our lymphatic system is part of our immune system. Okay, now let's look at the microscopic anatomy of the small intestine for just a moment. It's made up of simple columnar epithelium. We've heard that more than once. And the muscular layer as well is going to play a big role in just moving food in the forward direction for one, but also helping to break it down and digest it and put the nutrients within the food in closer contact with the mucosa so that we can absorb the nutrients. The design of the small intestine is quite interesting. It's optimized for absorption by increasing its surface area, and of course it is quite long, as we know. There are three types of folds, we could say: circular folds, villi, and microvilli. All of these work to increase surface area for absorption. The circular folds increases surface area the least, but these are the largest folds that are found within the intestinal wall, and they're going to allow for the chyme to flow in this spiral path, causing it to be in contact with the mucosa to promote both mixing of the chyme with digestive juices, but also nutrient absorption. Villi are these extensions that run like this. And so the purpose of these extensions, these villi, is to allow for a huge increase in surface area. So in other words, if you picture this as being flat, you could absorb food anywhere along that flat surface. But if we fold it instead, we can now absorb food or nutrients anywhere along this region, anywhere throughout here. So it increases or maximizes our ability to absorb nutrients. Then on top of the villi are microvilli, which are, think of them as just small villi, and they're not extremely evident on here. If you look closely, you can see them, but then they allow for you to absorb food anywhere along these microvilli. All in all, really increasing your ability to absorb, or really optimizing absorption. And you can see that the microvilli are really what increase the surface area the most, but of course the microvilli are dependent on the presence of villi. I don't expect you to know the specific numbers on this slide, but when we talk about water, our digestive tract receives about 9 liters of water per day on average, and it gets it in a variety of different ways, from the food we eat, from the drinks that we consume, and in large part by our secretions. 8 liters of it is going to be absorbed by your small intestine, and a much smaller amount by the large intestine. And so we're going to be voiding a very little bit overall. We take back a lot of it. How do we absorb water? Well, through osmosis. So it's going to follow solutes, and so nutrients and salts when they're absorbed. Now, in some cases, the large intestine absorbs too much. So let's say food is sitting within the large intestine for a longer period than it should. The large intestine can absorb more water than is normal, which really compacts or hardens the fecal material. And that's called constipation. So it's moving through too slowly. But in other cases, the large intestine might not absorb enough water, or maybe it's overburdened with water. Maybe food moved through the small intestine way too fast, meaning that the small intestine wasn't able to absorb the normal amount that it can because it just moved through too quickly. And so then it puts a lot more in the large intestine, and it can only absorb so much. And when this happens, it stays within the large intestine and ends up being passed through the body, and we call that diarrhea. There are other situations where maybe somebody consumes milk that contains lactose. This is a sugar. Or some bodies have trouble breaking down lactose. And so if lactose, a sugar, ends up within your large intestine because we couldn't break it down and absorb it, then because we might be deficient in lactase, you've probably heard of lactase deficiency, which is lactose intolerance. If you can't break it down, you can't tolerate it very well. So the lactose, instead of being broken down and absorbed, ends up within our large intestine. And it acts as this osmotically active substance where when it's present in the large intestine, it's going to attract water. So water is going to move from the intestinal cells, the large intestinal cells, into your abdomen or into your large intestine, the lumen of your large intestine, and that would promote diarrhea. It's also very much, lactose is very much, as a side note, gas producing as well. And if you're lactose intolerant, you know what that feels like. So your large intestine will end up receiving about 500 milliliters of indigestible residue per day, and that is reduced to about 150 milliliters because it will absorb water and absorb salts. And then at that point, anything that's left is going to be eliminated by the process of defecation. So let's look at the parts of the large intestine. We talked about the cecum already, the first part of the large intestine. Then as we move up, it's called the ascending colon. Sometimes the large intestine is collectively referred to as the colon, but the part that ascends is called the ascending colon. The part that runs transversely is called the transverse colon. The part that descends down is called the descending colon. Then we have this region here called the sigmoid colon, and it gets its name because it's S-shaped. And then we have the rectum here, and then the anal canal. Okay, we already know in terms of a little bit more detail in the large intestine about the ileocecal valve here, and this is where the cecum is going to be. So this is really the start of the large intestine. Another structure to point out is called the appendix. The appendix, I'm sure all of you have heard of, is this worm-like structure that hangs off the cecum, and it wasn't really that long ago that the appendix was thought to be a useless organ similar to the tonsils, but the appendix is made of lymphoid tissue, and so it's populated with lymphocytes, which contribute to fighting infection. There's also a lot of good bacteria found within the appendix, and so if for some reason the intestinal tract needs more good bacteria, then they can migrate from the appendix and repopulate the large intestine. And this would be important after instances of antibiotic use where it clears out all bacteria, including good bacteria. It needs to be repopulated for overall health because bacterial flora in the intestinal tract is thought to play such a huge role in so many things, such as our health. The final term is that you need to know is haustra, and haustra are where you see these more toned areas of the large intestine. So they're just pouches caused by muscle tonicity because it is smooth muscle. And the only reason that food can actually move throughout the small intestine and the large intestine is because of smooth muscle contraction. And on our final slide here, just ending off with the large intestine, we have the rectum, where fecal material is kept, and then the anal canal, where it would pass through the process of defecation. You can see a muscle here called the levator ani muscle, and the levator ani muscle is actually involved in supporting much of our pelvic floor. It has various roles, but that would be a decent summary of it. There are anal columns and anal sinuses that are found within the anus, and the basic role is their production of mucus, which assists with lubricating the fecal matter as it's being passed, making it easier to pass. Hemorrhoidal veins found here can become large and distended, and in this case they're called hemorrhoids, and they can either just remain within this region or they can be quite pronounced where they protrude outside of the anus. And the final point to make has to do with the presence of these sphincters, internal and external anal sphincters. In order for defecation to occur, the external anal sphincter, as well as some other muscles in the area, but certainly the external anal sphincter needs to be relaxed or voluntarily relaxed in order to allow for this process. Okay, that's the end of today's lecture. Thank you so much for listening.